And we are live with Andrew, or Andy Rotherham, as it were. I think he goes by both. Andy is a co-founder of Bellwether Education Partners, also a senior editor at the 74, which is an education nonprofit that publishes stories that you probably won't get anywhere else about education, specifically on new types of schools, new opportunities within education, whatever, things that the mainstream media probably don't cover. Also, Andy has a background in Democratic politics, having served in the Clinton White House as an advisor there also. And it's really there that I want to start. But welcome, Andy. Good morning.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me. Good morning.
I love the scenic backdrop. I'm loving it. Very nice where you are. Looks serene. Let's hope this conversation is serene. But here's where I want to start. So we go back to 1990, 92. You have Amber Reichkott-Young and a host of other Democrats align with people like Charlie Weaver, who is a Republican, and people like Ted Koldery, who I'm not sure what his politics were, but it seems like he was in the middle, somewhat of a moderate. You had people like Joe Nathan, who's very definitely left of center and the Democrat. And they come together, and Arnie, I think maybe Arnie Carlson was a governor that had something to do with it. I could be wrong about that. But anyways, you had a bipartisan group of people who crafted legislation that passed, even with union input, as a matter of fact, that gave us charter schools. One of the things that came new to the landscape in terms of an ed reform product that was an advancement of sorts. So you follow that through the Clinton administration and the Obama administration, and you had a pretty strong presence of people in the Democratic Party who actually were in favor of reforms to the traditional education system. Now here we are today. And my question for the day is, where is that guy? Where is that guy that stood with Joe Nathan, that stood with Obama, that stood with Clinton? Clinton 1 and 2, as a matter of fact, but seems to be missing right now. Who stole that guy, Andy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that person is around. They are looking to be activated and they're looking for a home. They don't see one. And so for a lot of people, if you're more sort of career oriented, they're not seeing that as a very fruitful career path up, which is why I think you see a lot of people sort of ebbing away from this, pulling their punches and so forth. A lot has changed. I mean, we can unpack sort of how we got from 2000, when Bill Clinton did a school accountability tour around the country, which included actually a stop at City Academy, the nation's first charter school, which served kids who had dropped out. And it was an effort to a school that brought them back in the system to help them finish high school. Started by an amazing educator named Milo Cutter. And Clinton visited that school in 2000. That was one of the coolest things I got to do when I was at the White House. And we went there and he talked about and paid the debt that was owed to people like that you mentioned, like Ember, Joe, Ted, this whole crowd. A lot has happened since then. So I think that person, there's still some left and there's still some people speaking out and so forth, but we can talk about, I think there's sort of a set of reasons why you're not hearing that. I don't know if you want to go through the history first. We can get to sort of what those reasons are, which would bring us to 2020 and kind of fill in the blanks, however you want to do it. But I think your diagnosis is right. That person is missing right now or doesn't quite know where to go.
Well, what do you think is the important perspective for how to frame that discussion? Like, I'm just making a general point, like the guy is missing, guy's missing right now. So what's the best way to look at that?
I think it's not just one thing, right? I think a couple of things have happened. So, first of all, structurally, things have changed. And you look, the Democratic Party is in the process of redefining itself as a debate inside the party. It's hard to miss how little school reform is actually a part of that conversation. To the extent it is, it's not in, I think, what you might consider sort of a reformist or equity oriented way, although obviously the word equity is up for grabs at this point politically. But it's a conversation that doesn't get into that. So that's the structural thing. And then the Republican side is like inscrutable. I mean, the Republican Party is sort of like a white dwarf star. I use that term deliberately. And is just like, it's unclear what's going to even like come out of that post Trump. And so structurally, where you go if you're a school reformer in terms of politics, there's really no real place you sort of easily graft onto. You're not really at home in either party. If you're someone a school reformer, and the sort of the thing about those school reformers you talked about in the 90s, who was focused on sort of both structural change but equity, and both of those things equally, and realizing that they need each other, and that they're in service of each other, that person has no place to go. Then I think you got the second problem. In 2008, people thought reformers had sort of won. Arne Duncan was becoming Secretary of Education, and you saw reformers taking over in these states. I mean, there was books being written about how like the teachers unions had been vanquished and the reformers had triumphed, and how did they do it, and how were they so smart, and so forth. And I feel like anyone who studies American politics, like as soon as people start like writing either like political obituaries or sort of political tales of heroics, you should be careful, because you're never as up as it looks like when you're up, and you're never as down as it looks like when you're down in American politics. And what that meant, though, is there's a huge pullback. People had concluded we'd won, and there was a huge pullback from sort of politics, the public debate, a lot of funding that had been previously directed towards that sort of big debate that we were having about these things, all through the No Child Left Behind era and all that. It sort of evaporated. And you saw in short order, a lot of those political leaders, there was sort of no cover for them, and they were sort of really out there on a limb. And so I think that's the second big piece, was just reformers stopped doing politics. And I don't mean just politics like in the partisan sense. I just mean like small p politics, like engaging in these debates, and paid a huge price for it. And then I think the third thing now is, ESSA was sort of just waving the white flag, right? And there's no argument now. And so what do people argue about? And I don't mean argument like you want to encourage like acrimony, but like we need to sort of to have political progress, you have to have arguments about things. And there is no argument right now. And so No Child Left Behind, whether you liked it or you didn't like it, it at least forced people to have a conversation about equity. And if not through this sort of standards-based regime, then what? It allowed you to say, okay, I hate No Child Behind. It then begged the question of, okay, so what's your alternative? What should we do? And there were different alternatives, and sort of intellectually honest people would have ones like, I believe in choice, or I believe in you should leave it up to local school districts, and then we can debate the merits of those ideas. Like, what is the argument?
Well, does it
now?
feel to you?
We get these arguments of the day, but what is the argument right now that we have?
Does it feel, though, like the reform side, especially on the Democrat reform side, the arguments were lost? I mean, if I think about some very specific things around No Child Left Behind, just testing, the argument was lost. Teacher evaluation, the argument was lost. Use of student performance as part of rating teachers, lost. Choice, lost. Accountability, lost. Now even charter schools went from being schools of hope, beacons of hope that were going to give kids in ghetto education deserts a chance, an opportunity. And it wasn't even going to require vouchers. It was just going to be an opportunity to get out of hood schools, but not get into private schools. So it was the perfect, middle ground. And now there's segregation academies. They're trying to reinstate white academies from the South and whatnot. Talk about a reversal of fortune in the narrative that was used to be a narrative of hope. And now it's a narrative of the destruction of the central democratic institution in the United States, which is the public school. How'd that happen?
Well, I mean, I think the segregation academy rhetoric was really an instructive moment, right? Because like, obviously choice, there is a sinister history there. It was used in the South as a tool of segregation, but there's also a liberation tradition there. And sort of the modern charter school movement was sort of distinct from those things. And I think, when you look at the history, you see like there's different pieces of history, but it's hard to argue that these urban charter schools that you're talking about were designed sort of in the same spirit as massive resistance in the South. Yet when people started saying that, like Randy Weingarten, the AFT leader, started saying that, like, it was telling how few people, and in particular how few white people, were willing to stand up and be like, no, that's like bad history. Yes, these things happened, but that is, you laying that at the door of charter schools today, that's crazy. And that's ridiculous. And the reason people didn't want to stand up is obviously, like, it's no fun to be on the losing side. No one wants to be on the wrong side of a political debate and so forth. And so, people saw the direction things were going. And so then people say this stuff, and it sticks. I think a question to dig into, though, is, Chris, everything you described, I mean, none of them are perfect. There's problems with charter schools. There's problems with accountability and testing and all the rest. But like every one of those, there's a lot of evidence that they actually are promising strategies for equity and have driven results. I mean, accountability systems have been shown they improve equity, not like, not in huge standard deviation changes, but they improve things for the kids who are least well served. Urban charter schools, it's impossible to argue with the track record. The data is just so clear across so many places that they're having a positive effect on kids' lives, all these things. So there's like a paradox here. Like everything you described that people are losing the argument, they're losing the political argument. But like, if you go into like the literature and you talk to people, and it's really fascinating when you step out of the education sort of crossfire and you go talk to like some rank and file economist, they're like baffled because they're like, well, the evidence seems to show, but then you people are all over here, having this huge fight. And so there's a real paradox there, which obviously is explained by politics, but I think is worth unpacking.
Well, I mean, the politics are one thing, but the storytellers, the journalists, the narrative that I discussed changed from them writing stories about the exceptional school, the beat the odds school, the one where the kids are, Black kids from the inner city doing amazing. Those stories have now taken way to privately managed, publicly funded schools that do no better than regular schools, and in many cases do worse. That is a common journalistic narrative now, which in turn creates a public perception that seems to differ from what you're saying the research says. And as a matter of fact, the way that scholars talk about the research, you would think that the research is mixed or for sure doesn't show an advantage to charter schools for kids.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard for people to get their heads around the research. If you want to, like all these education questions, you got to ask, like, there's always like a set of follow-up questions. And so in the case of, charter schools, the follow-up question, when people say, are charter schools any good? Well, tell me which ones where. And at the Bellwether website, we have a 200 slide deck for people who really want to dig through the research. There are some states where they're not doing well. Conversely, there's states and cities where they're doing quite well. In general, urban charter schools tend to outperform. Rural charter schools are mixed, slightly underperforming. Suburban are mixed, and there's some real reasons that are interesting in the suburbs around that. But urban charter schools just distinctly outperform other schools, and we should talk about that more forthrightly and talk about both the lessons there and the limits to those lessons and what it tells us. I find it fascinating, and it just speaks to the politics of this issue. Like, you can't find anywhere like a large high performing school district. You can find small ones. You can't, there's nowhere we're doing this well at scale. And even the best schools, and that would include the best charter schools in this, they're not getting us where we want to be from an equity perspective. They're much better than other alternatives. So if you're a parent making a decision in the moment, like it completely makes sense. But in terms of like big picture social change, they're not doing what we want them to do yet. And yet we don't talk about any of that. We have these crazy sort of debates divorced from the evidence, when in fact, everybody should be probably in a pretty heavy sort of questioning and empirical mode, trying to figure out, like, how do we learn and how do we do better?
Yeah. So when you say at scale, I think that's a question that always is an education question. Can you do anything at scale? Is it at scale? Is it at scale? And the question gets on my nerves sometimes, because if there's anything school districts, school leaders can't do, it's scale. They can scale failure quickly. And that's the history of public education. Public education has a consistent ability to scale failure. or to scale mediocrity. Failure and
Yeah.
mediocrity are different things. Like mediocrity, even for white kids. Like I don't think that I don't think it's obvious to a number of white people in the United States that are in what they consider to be good schools, just how mediocre they actually are and how they could be doing much better for their kids.
Well, it's our proxies also for like what's a good school, and there's like you sort of see some revealed preference around when we say like what is a good school. I think when you talk to people who work in education and they have a set of things that's different than like the average person, are sort of codes and signals for a good school.
Yeah, and if you get a school where nobody is graduating prepared to live good lives, we generally know that's not a good school. We can argue about everything else.
I find, like look at like especially in like the school reform wars of the aughts and the last decade, people like Michelle Rhee was shutting down schools where fewer than a quarter, in some cases fewer than a fifth of the kids were at proficiency, and she was still getting intense pushback that these were good schools. Why was she closing them down?
Yeah. Well, and okay, yeah. I mean, anytime you close a school, a group of people show up and say, this is the best school ever. And there are people who the day before us would have said, this is the worst school. You're not serving our community. And it's an amazing political transformation. Let's just talk about like some of the things that I think left of center, liberals and centrist and moderates are reverting to. So away from the schools of hope and charter school thing, but back to some traditional arguments around things like, as of this morning in my Twitter feed, Mike McGee is saying to me that integration is the only thing that worked at scale to close the achievement gap. And the reforms that we've had over the last 20 years, including charter schools, have not matched that success. So that's a traditional liberal argument. Integration is everything. Integration makes things happen. By my analysis, integration failed spectacularly everywhere that it was tried. And in the places where it was said to have worked, like the New Orleans of integration is Louisville. Louisville is the New Orleans of what New Orleans is to charter schools. New Orleans and Arizona are to charter schools. That's what Louisville, Kentucky is to integration. And they have a whopping achievement gap in that district. So help me understand, what's the utility in nouveau liberals, today's liberals, and right of center people or left of center people saying, let's just give up on some of this stuff we've been doing and go back to integration as the main thing?
Yeah, I don't quite understand. I mean, obviously, I'm not against integration. I think it's a powerful thing, and you want kids to go to school as much as possible with diverse student bodies, so they're exposed to different kinds of people and different kinds of ideas. I think we can oversell it, and yeah, I'm struggling to. I tend to more agree with you. Like it is for a whole bunch of reasons. Rooted in some history in terms of like housing patterns, rooted in the present in terms of limited choice options and all the rest, like where we've actually seen that at scale. I'm struggling a little bit with even just with the premise. I think what a lot of people, and in terms of, to answer your question, I think because nobody wants to be against it. Like nobody even wants to be like, well, is that like in 2020 America on the left, if you sort of are not sort of full-throated, integration's the thing, there might not be a chair for you. I think that's probably the blunt answer to your question. Meanwhile, like you've given voice, like parents are pragmatic. They want like in the moment, like what's going to be the best thing. And as you've pointed out, I think rightly and loudly, like urban parents are not, they're not waiting on white parents to come and save them. They want good schools now. And you see that in the charter sector with the demand for a lot of charter schools. Parents aren't interested in sort of grand schemes about social engineering. They want like their kids, they know their kids only going to be in third grade once. They want them in a good seat, with a good teacher in front of them. So yeah, I mean, so I think you can sort of see the appetite. The challenge becomes like pragmatically, what can you actually do on that? And there are some things I think in policy you can do to sort of nudge and incentivize that and so forth, but it is fundamentally limited. And even Obama, the stuff they ultimately proposed was fairly small beer relative to the challenge. Charters, meanwhile, have expanded more. They face political opposition and so forth, but they have expanded more. They're not necessarily a tool of integration. They tend to reflect the communities where they are. And then the third thing, and it gets to a little bit some of these contemporary debates, like these other schools that enjoy even lower barriers to entry, like micro schools, low cost privates, I think those could end up even being like more disruptive, and potentially greater tools of integration, because you even have less governmental hurdles and so forth to open those. And I mean, that's a little adjacent. We're having this huge debate. We can talk about later if you want, pods. You have to be an anti-podder or a pro-podder now. But these sort of alternative methods that don't have the same sort of regulatory hurdles to get through could be another tool there. But I mean, for me, like, yeah, all else equal, I think integrated schools are terrific. I look at the U.S. landscape, and like equal is usually not one of the adjectives that leaps to mind to describe it. So all else is rarely equal, and I think there's an element of pragmatism that this work demands, again, because kids, they get one shot and they can't wait for our big scheme. So what are we doing like now? What's the immediate line of sight to how we can give them a better opportunity to have a life full of choices?
I actually feel like the integration argument is damaging the true argument that we should be having about how do we expand opportunity? How do we expand the number of ways that we educate kids? How do we offer pathways that we don't have right now? Like, I'm looking for an abundance candidate somewhere in democratic education reform right now. But what I'm getting is regressives, progressives turning into regressives. We should retreat to the double down on the system, double down on the money, triple Title I, pay teachers more. Let's make sure that kids have no access to roads that get them out of education desert district traditional schools. Let's keep them in the unionized, bureaucratized, industrialized schools. That seems like a real retreat. And it feels like conservatism. It doesn't feel like progressive thinking.
Well, I mean, look, and we can get into this is, special interest politics, because somebody like me, like a lot of those things, I'm for those things too. But I've always wondered, why is it why choice and accountability, choice and resources, like why Democrats aren't like equally vocal about giving low-income families choice and about addressing these ridiculous school financing schemes that we have and having more equitable funding. Like and again, we can talk about the special interest politics that sort of create the atmospherics here, because why are all these things choices? Because if you actually just step back and you're like, what do we need to actually transform this system? They're not choices. We need it's a whole set of conversations of ands, not ors. But the politics force people into these camps and all these choices. And obviously, I mean, if you want to talk about, like, special interests are just an enormous part of that.
Yeah. So you mentioned pods. So we're right now in a situation where the government is basically telling parents, here are your kids, keep them at home. We're going to give them back to you. You're on your own for right now. We're going to have to figure out some things before we can figure out how we'll do school again in the future. So many parents across the country are saying, okay, that's a tough situation. Let me call up a bunch of my friends on Facebook, or whatever you call it when you Facebook people. I'm sure it's not calling, but let me connect with my friends on Facebook. We're going to set up a Facebook group. Thousands of us now have responded. Oh my God, is it possible that we could link together some of our own schools of our own making? That sounds like a progressive idea in some ways, like, community-based, grassroots, organically grown schools that treat kids as individuals, that will have some very personalized learning, if you think about it. Won't be bound by rules that say you can only learn from this time to this time, and this is when the bell rings, because you're all like mice in some Pavlovian kind of maze. Sounds pretty progressive to me. And immediately, just kind of like the anti-maskers, the people who are running around the country like freaking out because you're asking them to wear masks, we all of a sudden have the folks, the more liberal than thou, but this organically grown educational solution to government failure is going to exacerbate equity. Why is that the first response to something that's an alternative to a system that obviously has failed?
Yeah, I mean, I've read a couple of the op-eds. There was one in the Washington Post, there was one in the New York Times, and it was hard to miss. There was almost a very performative quality to them because they both acknowledged clearly, and I'm sure if they wasn't in the draft, like some editor said, like, hey, like, any good editors could be like, so what's the solution here? And they had to say, like, well, we don't really know. There really isn't one. So it was, if you do this, it's bad, and you're going to further inequality, but there was no alternative. And I feel like, look, that's 2020 politics, and I have a lot of questions about pods. Like, I don't even know how widespread this actually is. I mean, journalists, one's a good story, two's a trend, and three is like a widespread trend. And so who knows, like how much of this is actually going to happen over the next couple of months. But I don't understand how you can simultaneously be like against reopening school, and then at the same time be against parents doing whatever that they want to do or can figure out what to do for their kids. Like, it seems to me like you, at some level, you have to make a choice there. And if we're choosing not to open schools, and like that's become like obviously quite politicized, we can talk about that. But if we're making that choice, then you can't really get on parents for scraping and doing whatever they can, especially after the experience of the spring, which virtual education it did not go well. And I mean, it didn't go well for a lot of kids because they weren't getting any of it. And there's a huge equity issue there. And then even the kids who were getting it, it was nothing approaching one-to-one of what they would have got with live instruction.
Yeah. My own personal experience with the distance learning was it was fine before the school district got involved. So, in the beginning of this, the stay-at-home orders, my kids had a schedule created by me, and we pulled together some resources, and we did the Khan Academy, and I was looking at things from Google and others. And because I know my kids, I knew what would bore them and what wouldn't. And I found the cool things. Like, I looked for the things that, like, for each one I have 3 kids at home. So each of them, I found something for them. And then the school district said, okay, we figured it out. We've got everything together now. We're going to do distance learning. The teachers are available to you, whatnot. And my kids immediately hated it. They hated everything about it. There wasn't much teaching going on. It was sending a lot of worksheets without a lot of teaching, and the kids were getting frustrated because there was no teaching to go along with them. The hours were weird. The access to the teachers was weird. Their use of the technology, it was like the first time that they had ever touched a computer in some cases. It was almost like, oh my God, what is this Google slide thing? So it was kind of a problem when the district got involved.
Ours was uneven, I would say, which is, and what I've heard from a lot of people, like some of it was actually really good, and some of the teachers, some of it wasn't. And teachers were feeling, and I'm not speaking about my own kids' teachers, but just more generally, what I heard from lots of teachers, the ones that were doing a good job, there was, again, this like the systemic pull and this leveling, and they were being pulled back from doing. And you'd talk to superintendents, and you'd ask, like, how are you figuring out, like, with engagement rates, the teachers who have really good engagement, like, what are you like learning from them? And people just weren't even asking those questions. And teachers were feeling really frustrated that they had these ideas they either wanted to try or that they had tried and knew worked, and they were getting pulled back from it. Which I think sort of, obviously, that sort of culture around sort of innovation, experimentation, there's some larger implications for that for some of the other issues we're talking about. That was more our experience. We're right now, though, Chris, you'll enjoy. We've been doing sort of homeschool, and right now I'm doing a unit all this whole time in addition to the school. We're doing a unit right now on Supreme Court jurisprudence on student rights. So, not just like Tinker, but we're doing, West Virginia Barnett, and we're doing Bethel and Kullheimer and all of this. And so I pity their teachers when they do actually go back to live school, because I've got these 2, adolescent street lawyers running around now.
I think that's awesome. Actually, so look how the system reacts, though. Look at this. The latest in school segregation, private pandemic pods. First of all, that's like the worst kind of name for a school ever. Pandemic pods.
Some solid alliteration, though. You gotta like this.
Pandemic pods. I tweeted out something this morning that showed a picture of what school might look like when we come back into potentially, if we come back into session, and it looks worse than pandemic pods. I mean, it's the social distance version of education it looks grim. It doesn't look like something we should be putting kids into. Let me see if I can find it here for you. And I just wonder, are pods and home-based solutions and the use of libraries and the use of the fact that America has more open information available to people for free of any society ever in history, is it really worse that parents and communities and churches and districts start working together in ways to make sure that we get kids a humane education than just kind of saying, let's wait until the schools can get back together, but don't try anything else until that happens? I think it's like a false promise.
Well, I think it's also politically a problem. If you want to improve equity in this country, you have to do it by expanding opportunity, giving people who don't have tools, don't have opportunities, as you said, don't have roads right now, giving them those things. If you come at it through a frame of we're going to achieve equity by essentially limiting other people's ability to do things, like the political problem there is obvious. The history on that is abundant. And so I'm a huge believer in the sweeteners. And you look at like school districts. I was just talking to a colleague last time. We were talking about Jerry Wiest in like Montgomery County, and the way Jerry was able to sort of try to improve equity there and get more kids into AP programs and so forth was by making it about like AP and excellence. And then you didn't get any pushback. I mean, you've sort of seen Montgomery County's obviously got some issues. You've seen them in the news the past few months, but you didn't get any pushback from white affluent parents when you did that. If you put in this AP frame, even though it was redirecting resources to low-income kids, often minority kids, to help them in the AP program. But if Jerry had just said, "Hey, we're going to redirect resources and we're going to do this thing for AP," like these parents would have gone nuts, right? And so it was a little bit of a sleight of hand. But it worked, right? And it improved opportunity and AP course taking among kids who hadn't been taking AP went up. And from where I sit, that's like a good thing. That's expanding opportunity. That's what we should be doing. And I just tell that story by way of like, there's a way to sort of do the politics here and achieve the equity goal. And there's a way to sort of do the politics and create enemies. And this is the latter. And I feel like just given the structure of education in this country, there's already enough choke points and blocking and special interest that like, why do you want to then activate like new foes? We've got our hands full like as it is. So why are we trying to get new people into the fight against us? And the other thing about it, Chris, I'd be interested in your take, like, there's such a class-based thing to it in the sense that like low-income families, especially with school closed, are who don't have jobs that are socially distanced kinds of jobs and so forth, are scrambling for what do you do? Who cares for kids? How do you cover? What do you do? Kids are together. And suddenly, like when affluent parents start doing it, like we get this reaction. And I feel like we get this reaction at the expense of any serious conversation about not reopening schools has huge consequences for millions of American families who are not lawyers and consultants and, whatever else, who actually need to like go someplace physically to work. And like, where's the op-ed? Where are the op-eds like about that? And I mean, obviously it doesn't help that Trump has gotten involved, as always, he's a calming, reassuring presence in any debate, right? Like it doesn't help that he's sort of jumped in and like supercharged this debate. But where's the conversation about the school reopening? Conversation is complicated from a public health standpoint and so forth, but also from an equity standpoint, and for whom deciding whether or not the pod is a luxury and who is it like a situation that's been foisted upon you because of the dynamics of your life.
Can you see it as a tenable argument that from a public health standpoint, opening schools is not an option, period. So the argument around it is mute. It's just not from a public health standpoint and science. To be smart, there is no reopening schools in our particular, after the catastrophe of leadership and the way that we've handled COVID, we're in a situation now where we're not like Canada or Sweden or somewhere else where they had real leadership. So because of that, reopening schools is a false argument. We shouldn't even be having it. It's not going to happen. Not if we care about killing people. So that being said, is it really a bipartisan? Is there a problem that the bipartisan solution that really is needed is not one that either party wants to deal with, which is probably something like Andrew Yang's universal basic income? Because if people can't go to work, if families are not secure, if they don't have a place to put their kids, you don't have a people, you don't have a country. And probably neither party wants to tangle with UBI, with the universal basic income. Is that a reasonable argument?
Well, I would start with, I agree with you. Like the reopening schools is now fraught, and not everywhere. Like we should, like it does vary by place. I think this is part of the problem with the nationalizing it. You look at some communities where case rates are really low and things have been going pretty well, and they could probably open schools in a responsible way. lots of other places where you can't. So I wouldn't universalize, but I think you're right, because of a lack of leadership at the federal and state level, and frankly, just a lack of. I mean, I'm frustrated just in general, like the American people's like inability to just make even basic sacrifices to try to help us get to the other side of this, and sacrifices to help people who are being, disproportionately bearing the burden of this disease. To me, is like appalling. I didn't realize, like, in the Constitution, apparently there's like a right to eat at Applebee's. I missed that part, and that like we can't like just stop doing things for a little bit collectively to try to as a society get on the other side of this is extremely frustrating, which then leads to we're in this situation with the range of choices for schools is artificially narrowed as a result. Yeah, I mean, I think the conversation I would love to see happen is, if not pods, then what? Or pods and what kind of policy support should we put in place? The problem with that is, like, that probably involves some sort of individualized benefit or support for parents, which is obviously a non-starter among a lot of people, particularly on the Democratic left. But that is, if we're going to have kids at home in sort of a completely fragmented system, you're going to have a solution that ties to that. And one interesting sort of side note is, somebody made a really good comment yesterday. We were discussing this on Twitter, and it was like, depending on the size of these pods, they could end up actually undoing any of the social distancing benefits that come from closing school anyway. If you end up with enough people who are sort of going back and forth in and out of these pods, then back into their own life, it could actually undo some of what we're ostensibly trying to do through not opening schools and continuing social distancing.
When you think about Democrats, what about the idea that Bernie is wrong on education and probably right on the economy, and and no one is ready to go the distance on that because we're a capitalist country?
Yeah, the thing about Bernie, Bernie's obviously an acquired taste, and I'm not a Bernie bro, but the thing that he talked about on the trail that didn't get as much attention as I had hoped, and I really do think ties back to education, is he talked about like just the life of constraint, sort of desperation, frustration that a lot of people lead because of these various structural issues, the quality of our education system. And I feel like that is something, and I was disappointed that it didn't get more attention, because, like, whether you agree with him or not, I thought it was fantastic that he was raising that, and that those are the kinds of things that we should be talking about in terms of how do you create a society where people have more choices and more opportunity. And right now we've created one where there's a fair amount of constraint, and I think schools are a big culprit in that. And you could say that without sort of blaming schools for everything and so forth, but schools are not doing their part to sort of propel people into a life where they have opportunity and choices, roads out. I like how you put it. And I really liked that he talked about that. And then you combine that with Andrew Yang, who I think talked about UBI in a way that sort of changed how we think about it. And obviously we're sort of in some ways doing like a default version of that right now to prop the economy up. I do think there's some questions there. I find it fascinating, though, that people are great with giving out money, and I am in general. I think, increase the child tax credit. Like, you don't get an argument out of me on any of this stuff. But as soon as you start talking about it in the context of any kind of individual benefit around schools and empowering parents, you get like a full stop, even from people who would otherwise consider themselves, extremely social justice oriented, consciousness raised, woke, whatever. As soon as you start talking about empowering families individually, all hell breaks loose.
That's because they really believe in the government. They believe in the system a lot, really. There's a lot of system love, a lot of, and listen, like, for a lot of them, especially the more privileged leftist, it seems to me that if the system worked really well for you and for your family, you have a lot of affection for it because it's part of your upbringing. It's part of your life. You have like romantic feelings about like this thing that made you. It made you who you are. And if only we could make everybody else as good as it made us, that would be great. Not realizing there's some real problems with that analysis.
Yeah, I think so. I also think, like, I've written about this, as you know, I think in reform, there's a blind spot, and just in education leadership in general. most of the people making the decisions and so forth were really good at school. You don't bump into a lot of people who like, it's a pretty, you know, over credentialed group of people, and you don't bump into, they were rewarded for it. They jumped through the hoops. You know, as a friend of mine said, he's like, everybody likes the race. You know, everybody loves the race that they won. And like, and, you know, and I think that creates, so it's about how do I make this thing that I loved for more people? And in fact, like, most people don't actually love it. Like, they're bored, frustrated, or as you see, they leave because they really feel like this place does it. And that, again, totally plays out along race and class lines, obviously. And we don't like talk about that. And, you know, why is that? And I remember just my own schooling, I was always struck. You'd see people, you know, I'd watch kids like jumping over the fence. You know, I went to a large public high school, you know, 2,000 kids. So there was some anonymity, and you'd watch kids like skipping class, jumping over the fence, taking off. And I was always like, even like at a young age where you're pretty much an idiot, at least I was an idiot. Like, I still was like, I had the sense to be like, this is kind of fucked up. Like kids are literally running from this place. Like, that's weird. Am I allowed to say that on your show? Sorry. If I,
yeah, absolutely. Listen, it is what it is, man.
I don't know if we're supposed to be PG. Sorry. It's pretty screwed up. Like, kids are like running from this place. And I was like, that's so weird. Like, like that's considered like, okay, they are literally running and throwing themselves over a fence. And like, that's always like stayed with me. And I don't think we talk, that's another thing I just don't think we talk about enough. Like, school kind of sucks for a lot of people.
Even people where it semi worked for them, there are many people that didn't like it. And, you know,
they endured.
Yeah, they endured. And if they liked a lot of it had to do with the social part, like socializing with friends, hanging out in the parking lot after school, like running their Camaros around the block and staying at the school for half the Saturday or stuff like that. But you know, a question more tactically, since I got you here, you really, I think, have great insights about the politics of things. It was just 3 or 4 years ago that one of the most popular presidents ever in the history of presidents left office, who also happened to be like one of the biggest school reform boosters in the history of school reform, the most powerful. Like, unions found it very hard to deal with him. Because he was so popular. So that's why they had to like savage Arnie so badly. You know, they had to savage him badly because he was the white guy that they could savage, because they couldn't savage the president. But this is only like three or 4 years ago. And I'm looking at the lineup of who's helping Biden create the Democratic platform on the education part right now. And there's no seat for the Obama follower. There's no seat there for a president who just 3 or 4 years ago, who's still actually, you know what, who's still super popular today, right? Is more popular than the current president today. And there's no seat for him, for his vice president, who's forming a think tank, an internal think tank of people to help him understand education. What's up?
Yeah, I mean, look, and people like the thing that gets said is, don't worry, it's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. And I always feel like that's what they tell you always right before the boom drops.
Right.
And that these platforms don't mean anything. Don't pay attention to the unity plan and the stuff it's got in there on testing and charter schools. Like, that's all, you know, that's just words. Don't pay attention to it. But like, words, you know, words matter. Yeah, I think it's an issue. Reformers are clearly sort of marginalized. You know, it's worth noting, I think Obama was a very competent president. I mean that in absolute terms, not just compared relative to this current circus, but just in general. He ran a competent administration. It was, you know, relatively scandal and dysfunction free by historical standards. You know, so you got to give him a lot there. But he did sort of slowly walk back from education reform. The Obama, the senator, and then Obama, the race to the top champion, and then, you know, 2012 and after, there was like a steady ebb. You know, they just sort of walked back on a lot of this stuff, and that culminated with, you know, Obama basically telling Democrats on the Hill, like, don't hang me out to dry on accountability, cut whatever deal you're going to cut on ESSA, and an ESSA bill that, like, you can say a lot of things about it, but it's hard to say that that's like an equity oriented bill, and is really a walk back, frankly, from the Bush stuff and from the Clinton stuff. And people were concerned about that. That was obviously pre 2020, when there's more immediate concerns now. But that bill was not a good bill on equity. And that, I think, left, you know, that's one of the reasons, again, we don't have like much to argue about, and that it's sort of just this weird sort of stasis right now. I mean, I think the reformers have to make a decision. Do they want to be loved and get invited to all the fun dinner parties, or do they want to be respected and get something done? I think, and I'm not being glib, I think that's like a serious question that the reform community needs to ask itself. We were better as insurgents with a clear North Star. And I worry, and I've written this, like, it's not a popular thing to say, but I do worry, like, one of our signal accomplishments, maybe we've sort of just become the people we set out to replace just even quicker. Cause like, it's hard to miss, like there's a whole lot of adult politics at the forefront of everything in reform right now. And like the line of sight to what does this mean for kids and families can be pretty blurry sometimes.
What do you think about the idea that the Republicans actually forced the Democrats' hand by retreating themselves? So when you mentioned ESSA, you had Randy Weingarten working with Senator, who was it? Now I'm trying to remember who it was on the Republican side that she was working with up at the Hill, and they were agreeing on things like testing and the overreach of accountability and the overreach of the federal government and NCLB. And it was Republicans that were starting to walk back and get soft on things like choice and accountability, which, kind of, makes it a little bit harder when you have your teachers union on the left working with your Republicans on the right to weaken accountability and traditional reforms.
Well, look, Randy, you got to give her credit. She is playing chess while reformers are playing checkers, for sure, to use that overused cliche. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when she said tenure isn't a job for life, when she said tenure is a job for life, and that's not good. And so that's why I'm going to bring in Ken Feinberg, like all these iterations over the years. And Randy she understands people kind of forget all this stuff. Or either genuinely forget it or willfully forget it. And so she's very adept at positioning herself in the moment. She's an incredible tactician. I think there's an expiration date on the teachers unions over time because of Janus and some other things, but like that expiration date's not obviously 2020. This is sort of it's a slow glide, and that's going to be a problem for Democrats at some point, but not an immediate problem. I think I'd answer your question with a little bit of a question though. Look, the Republicans, it is easier when the Republicans were pressuring on things. It definitely, it creates a political tension that can be a positive political tension. And that's actually like documented, like Brian Hassel, his PhD dissertation was actually about how Republican pressure on charter schools was actually, and on school choice in general, forced Democratic action on charter schools and had like a salutary forcing effect on increasing options there for kids, because people wanted to figure out a compromise, and charter schools became the compromise. So that's just one example of what I think is a long trend. Again, the Republican Party, like who knows what they're about right now. They've sort of just imploded, and it's hard to even conceive of them at this point as like an organized political party with a sort of instinct for a political party. And I mean, I'm not being pejorative. I just mean like it's hard. Like it's like, I mean, you just look at the debates that they're having. Susan Collins and the Freedom Caucus in one party at this point with like it's just weird. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. But so all that's true, but I don't want to let Democrats off the hook, because like you should still, if you're a party that's supposed to be for the little guy, it's supposed to be about expanding opportunity for the little guy. Like you've got to do those things regardless of what the other party is doing. And you need to do those things in like an affirmative, non-reactive way. And it's hard to miss just how hard it is for the Democratic Party often to do that. And again, that's special interest politics and, and pressure, how good we are when we're actually doing that. And you have those coalitions. That's like the Democrats are really strong when they do that, but how hard it is politically to build those coalitions. And so you end up with this sort of all these sort of half measures and sort of neutered versions of all this stuff. And I think that's, in 2020, it's probably not a huge problem, because I think Trump, the election, you can sort of see the contours, and I don't think you're going to see a lot of single issue voters on education. Certainly not me. People are going to vote for Biden, almost regardless. And so it's not going to force that conversation, but that is a conversation that has to happen at some point. You can't be for the little guy and not be for both empowering the little guy and really tearing down some of the obstacles to the little guy. One of the big ones being a public school system that's just inequitable in so many ways. And I'll just close. This is the part I said I had a question for you. Like, I find it so stunning that we're having a huge and really important national conversation on race. And like, when it comes to schools, it's like crickets.
Yeah, I mean, it says to me something about the way that like the left and the right are fighting within ed reform. The right doesn't want any mention of anything having to do with social justice. They think that the bipartisan coalition is just fine as long as you don't ever make us talk about racism, the institutional racism for sure, systemic racism for sure, anything that makes our country not look as great as it is, anything that makes me uncomfortable as a well-heeled white man in a think tank in Washington, D.C. who pretends to be the everyman, like anything that makes me uncomfortable like that. So you guys on the left, you're ruining education reform because you introduced all that stuff and we didn't used to have to talk about that stuff before. So it's your fault. And the people on the left are not contending with the fact that their party is having an internal war between Marxism and centrism, right? And the centrists are losing that war. So the Marxists are basically like, it doesn't matter about race, it's about class. And, if the only problem with the schools is we haven't given them enough money. We just need to give them a ton of money because it's about class. It's not about race, all the race stuff. So the Bernie people are very much post-racial, anti-identity politics. It's like the left and the right are agreeing on identity politics right now, which is really interesting. The Marxist left.
Yeah. Well, you can't identity politics. You don't just get to have the ones you like. You get them all. Which is one problem with identity politics. Yeah. But I would push a little bit on though, like I've always been struck by some of this debate about like we shouldn't talk about race because like in the 90s and like the No Child Behind You, like we talked about race a lot. That was a whole point behind a lot of people fought hard and paid real political prices around like you got to disaggregate accountability. It's got to be explicit. And the civil rights community was there on that we have to sort of transparency. I mean, that was like the No Child Left Behind coalition, it was like the Citizens Commission for Civil Rights. It was, the Ed Trust. It was all these groups saying, you've got to put this in. There's been like a shift away from that. And then, so when I hear this debate about, well, we shouldn't talk about race, it rings a little ahistorical to me because that was like a big animating feature of a lot of what was going on was the system is like inequitable, not randomly. It is inequitable along lines, race, class, and ethnicity. And so we need to have transparency and accountability. You can argue about like how well that's worked. I think the academic literature is a little different than what you hear in the political debate. But like those were the conversations, and that was sort of some of the political organizing principles. And then it's like we almost like.
But that changed, Andy.
We got away from that. Yeah, totally.
Well, the right got away from it in one way. The race hammer was great as long as it was going to be a tool to beat down big government, and it was going to be a tool to kind of like destroy unions, and it was going to be a tool to like achieve some political goals that they thought were savvy, were foxy, good goals. But they will also say that Obama ruined everything by being black as a president, and by being black as a president and being for these things, then everything that they were for before suddenly became overreach. Became tyranny, became federal tyranny. Race to the top is, the day before Race to the Top, competition was a beautiful thing to Republicans and to the right. Yeah. The day after a black man pushed Race to the Top, it suddenly became federal overreach. Oh my God, I can't believe we've got all this damn federal overreach. Some of the same people that called the guy out for wearing a tan suit are completely silent about a guy right now that is destroying all the major institutions of the United States and actually sending militarized police to fight against American citizens exercising their First Amendment. And where is the criticism right now? So, I mean, in every form that played out too, is that a wrong analysis?
No, actually, I think that's actually a really smart, particularly this point about that people were fine when this was being used against, their villains. And then once it became sort of more ubiquitous, that like you got pushback. And then obviously I think there is something to the race element with Obama that you raise. And also like it made me think of like a lot of the resistance on the accountability came from these suburban school districts within states. I mean, that was certainly the case in Virginia, where I am, but it was the case nationally. who they were fine with disaggregated accountability, yeah, transparency, until like it was like, hey, you know, these like world-class school districts, you actually have like big achievement gaps and you have a dropout problem. And then suddenly it was, you know, can we have a little less, let's have a little less radical transparency. And so I think, which also sort of, I think, fuels your narrative, these ideas in the abstract. Evan Bayh, who was a senator when No Child Left Behind was pretty instrumental. No Child Left Behind is a senator from Indiana, Democrat. Evan Bayh had, when the law was passed, he said everyone's going to love accountability. They love it. They love all this stuff until it's put in place and it applies to them. And that turns out to be a pretty prescient observation.
Well, and you know, listen, during ESSA, it was superintendents in Republican areas that were going to the Republicans saying, listen, man, get the government off our back. Right. So we forget that there are Republican leaders of school districts. Right. And all that red that you see when you see a map across the country, all of that red that's in between the blue cities and the blue parts of states, they all have superintendents. And they have teachers unions, and they have people who have a vested interest in getting the government off their back because they don't want to be accountable for any results, the same as the people in the blue cities. So I think we always gave them too much of a free pass on the idea that they were really for accountability in the main. Where do we go? What's the big idea now, Andy? Where do we go now? I feel like reform is on the ropes. I feel like people on the left are definitely looking for ways to get out of the discussion. Maybe we should just focus on race and racial equity, and maybe we should put everybody through a restorative justice, trauma-informed, you know, TP into a TP, and everybody just kind of, you know, have ceremonies around like race and that stuff. And let's forget about pedagogy, the importance of quality teachers, the importance of, you know, quality systems and great systems leaders, and all of the things that have been the mainstay of reform. That's passé now. That's kind of old school. So what do we do now?
So I think it's the old fashioned agenda. It's high quality, you know, it's good standards, high quality curriculum, adequate resources, good accountability, and choice. Like, I think that formula actually works. I know that's like makes me seem like old and doddering and no new ideas. I think that formula works. And then we need to be figuring out, as I said earlier, like even our best is not good enough. So what does the innovation look like? But let me bounce an idea, saying I think about. I'm struck. I mean, it's hard to miss in some of the conversations that are happening now. There's a conflation of sort of race and politics, and an assumption that all Black people in particular are sort of very left progressive, which if you sort of spend any time outside of left progressive places, you know, is not the case. And it seems kind of weird to stereotype Black people like that in general. There's a range of political viewpoints, and this shows up in polling. But almost to a person, at least friends of mine, people I know, like the two institutions that grate and chafe and create real serious resentment are, and quite understandably, police and schools, where people feel there's a systematic problems with systematic racism, systematic just under service, the whole nine yards. And so I like wonder, what is the politics of that? And it strikes me as a pretty essential politics, because that is like corrosive to our civic life. If you have Americans who systematically think those are the two most common things that as an American you're going to interact with government in terms of government services, it's going to be police and it's going to be schools. I mean, you go to the DMV, it's like an inconvenience, but you don't do it all the time, and it doesn't really affect like the outcome of your life. Police and schools do. And so, like, I hate to leave you. I'm supposed to be the guest. I hate to leave you with a question, but I'd be interested in your take. It strikes me like that's the politics of public service reform, and by extension of civic reform, because it strikes me that's like just a huge cancer at the heart of our civic life that we do not pay attention to. And I'm just struck anytime you have a group of people with diverse views, but they align on a couple of things, I feel like you should pay attention to those couple of things.
Well, this is going to be a dissatisfying answer, Andy, but I'm going to give it because it's my most
Sounds like it'd be an honest one.
It's my most honest one. White supremacy is a two-winged bird. It has a left wing and a right wing. And the left wing of the bird loves Mother Mary, the maternal altruistic teacher. She's a saint. And that's why public schools are untouchable to the romantic left, is because the teacher in them and her unions are the union of the Blessed Mother Mary to them. Schools are temples, teachers are saints. Their moms who were teachers were amazing and altruistic and all that stuff. And on the right, the police are soldiers of God. The police are the ones that keep all the order and the strength of the country that we have and whatnot. They're only defense against the unwashed Negroes. So oddly enough, the more the left wing and the right wing fight, the more they balance each other out. And the careful third party observer would say, the more you guys fight, you're creating an equilibrium that actually keeps you in power and keeps us out of power. Right? Like the savvy kind of third party person looking at this will say, you guys seem to be fighting, but it's weird how the more you fight, you create a physics that keeps you in power and keeps us out of power.
Well, you'll be happy to hear. I've been doing ed reform now for over 20 years. So I'm good with Sisyphean tasks. So like this strikes me as a good one to take on. But I must be more of a glutton for punishment than the average bear.
Well, Andy, I appreciate you coming on today. This was great. This is
really
exactly
appreciate
what I
having
wanted.
you.
Yeah, this is exactly what I wanted. Some smart conversation about where are we at with the Democratic reformer. I hope that we see a reemergence of something smart. Someone, like something smart that we could put forward that would be the 2.0. We can't have the Obama Democrat anymore. So, what'd you say?
Sorry, I was saying I thought you're done. I apologize.
No.
I'm saying I hope we can do it face to face again. Like this is nice, but it is not the same.
Yeah, well, it's the highlight of my morning every morning. That tells you about my life right now. My morning is talking about smart people every day about this. Listen, if you guys have been watching this, for those of you who have been watching and listening, Andy Rotherham is the co-founder and the leader of Bellwether Education Partners. You can Google him and find him there. His Twitter handle has been going across the bottom. It's @A_Rotherham. And you can find him on Twitter, follow him, and link up with him. And as always, if you wanted more information about today's show, you can send me an email at christopher@activist.com. I'm happy to get back to you. Thank you all for watching, for listening. Andy, once again, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate the insights.
Thank you.